Hello, my friends, and welcome to Night Whisper. This is a quiet place where we drift together into an unanswered sky slowly, calmly, and without fear. Here, we don't rush toward conclusions. We listen, we observe, and we let the mystery breathe. If these stories bring you a sense of calm or keep you company through the night, you're always welcome to stay with us. Subscribing gently helps this space grow, and it allows more quiet minds to find their way here. You can also leave a soft, like if the story helps you relax, unwind, or feel less alone beneath the night sky. And if any thoughts rise as you listen, you are welcome to share them in the comments below. What if everything we know about aerial surveillance is wrong? Because of one night in 1956, over 5 hours, radar stations in eastern England tracked something moving at impossible speeds, stopping dead in the sky, then reappearing on multiple systems at once. Fighter jets were scrambled, pilots locked onto it, and for a brief moment, the hunter became the hunted. No one ever confirmed what it was. No crash, no debris, no explanation that fully fits. Even today, decades later, this case is still classified as unidentified in the most literal sense. So the question isn't just what they saw, it's what we're still seeing and can't explain. Chapter 1. The sky that shouldn't change. The night over eastern England did not begin with anything unusual. It began the way most nights in 1956 did in this part of the world. Quiet, steady, almost careful in its stillness. The kind of darkness that settles over farmland without hurry, as if it knows the people below it are used to its presence. Fields stretched out in long, invisible geometry. Narrow roads cut through villages that had already dimmed their lights. Even the wind, when it moved, seemed to do so without urgency, brushing over the land like a passing thought. And yet, beneath that calm surface, something else was always awake. Not in the way people imagine danger, not as something loud or dramatic, but as systems. Radar systems rotating slowly in their endless sweep. Operators sitting in dim rooms where the glow of screens replaced the sky itself. Eyes trained not on stars, but on signals that might, at one moment, become important. This was the Cold War sky, an invisible space that had already been divided in the minds of nations. Nothing above it was ever truly neutral anymore. Every movement had meaning. Every unknown trace had a question attached to it. Even silence had become something that needed to be checked twice. At RF Lakenheath and RF Bentwaters, this awareness was not abstract. It was routine. Men worked in shifts that blended into one another. Coffee cooled beside consoles. Conversations stayed brief, practical, restrained. The work demanded focus, but also beseems the ability to watch nothing happen for long periods and still believe that something might happen at any moment, because that was the truth they all understood, even if no one said it aloud. The sky was never empty. It only appeared that way, and on nights like this one, that illusion felt especially thin. There were moments during those hours when everything seemed almost suspended. Radar screens showed only familiar patterns. No alerts, no urgency, just a slow rhythm of surveillance, continuing as it always had. But sometimes, in those quiet intervals, operators would notice something they could not easily describe later. A sense that the system was not just observing the sky but participating in a conversation it did not fully understand. A faint hesitation in a return signal. A shape that resolved too cleanly, then dissolved too quickly. A movement that did not quite match expectation. Most of these moments were dismissed, and rightly so. Equipment has limits. Atmospheres shift. Distance plays tricks on perception. Professionals are trained not to build meaning out of noise. Still, the human mind does not remain entirely untouched by repetition. When you watch the sky long enough through machines, you begin to notice when it feels different, even if you cannot yet prove it. And that night, something about the atmosphere of observation itself felt slightly more alert than usual. Not because anything had happened yet, but because the possibility of something happening felt closer than normal. Far away from the radar rooms, the countryside remained unaware of this subtle tension. Farmhouses continued their slow rhythm of evening routines. Roads carried only the occasional passing vehicle. The horizon held no warning signs, no visible disturbances, no reason for concern. If someone had been standing outside looking up, they would have seen nothing worth remembering. But that was always the quiet contradiction of nights like this. What mattered was not what the eyes could see. It was what the instruments could detect when the eyes could not. And so the radar stations continued their sweep, tracing invisible arcs across the sky, building a continuous record of absence that, on most nights, remained just that absence, until it didn't. Because somewhere in that structured silence, something was about to register differently. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough to be noticed by the people, trained to ignore almost everything that was not certain. A return would appear where no return should be. At first, it would look like any other small anomaly, something to be checked, compared, and possibly dismissed. That is how most stories like this begin, without warning, without ceremony, without anyone realizing they are crossing into something that will later be remembered. The operators would not immediately know that this particular signal would not fade like the others. They would only notice that it stayed longer than expected. And that small difference, almost nothing at first, would become the first break in the night's quiet balance. The sky, which had seemed unchanged for so long, was about to be observed in a way it had not been observed before. And once that observation began, it would not remain simple for very long. A signal appears where silence was expected. Chapter 2. The first echo on the screen. At first, it did not feel like anything important. That is how most strange things begin inside a radar room, quietly, almost politely, as if they are waiting to see whether anyone is paying attention. On the screen at RAF Lakenheath, the return appeared like countless others that had come before it. A small contact, a single point of presence in a vast field of electronic silence. Nothing about it demanded immediate concern. Nothing about it announced itself as extraordinary. But it also did not behave like the others. And that difference, subtle at first, is what began to pull attention toward it. The operator watching the display had seen thousands of such signals. He understood their habits, how weather interference smeared across the screen in loose, uncertain patterns, how distant aircraft produced predictable arcs, how equipment noise flickered briefly, then vanished as quickly as it arrived. This one did not flicker. It held not in a static way, but in a structured movement, as if it understood the grid it was moving through. It advanced across the radar scope with a speed that caused the first quiet hesitation in the room. Not panic, not alarm, just that slight pause that happens when the brain recognizes something that does not immediately fit any familiar category. The operator adjusted his focus, checked the calibration mentally without needing to speak it aloud, looked for the usual explanations. Interference, overlap, atmospheric distortion, anything that would restore the world back into its expected shape. But the return remained consistent. It crossed one section of monitored airspace, and then another, maintaining continuity in a way that made it difficult to treat as noise. Noise does not travel with purpose. Noise does not maintain structure over distance. Noise does not behave like something moving from one point to another with intent. And yet this did. Somewhere in the background, another operator noticed the same thing. A brief exchange followed, calm, controlled, almost routine in tone. The kind of communication that avoids escalation until escalation becomes unavoidable. There is always a threshold in these rooms, a point where curiosity becomes verification. They had not reached it yet, but they were approaching it. The signal continued its path. Then something happened that changed the character of the observation entirely. It did not just move. It moved too cleanly, as if the sky itself had become too organized around it. Radar returns are rarely perfect. Even stable aircraft produce slight irregularities in their tracking. Atmospheric conditions introduce softness into the edges of movement. Nothing in the real world moves through radar space without some form of imperfection. But this contact seemed unusually precise, too stable to be noise, too fast to be conventional traffic, too coherent to be random. The operator leaned slightly closer to the screen, not because he expected danger, but because attention had quietly shifted from passive monitoring to active interpretation. The mind begins doing this automatically in such situations. It tries to build a model, even before there is enough information to justify one. A passing aircraft, possibly, but no scheduled flight matched the behavior. A reflection error? Unlikely. The signal persisted across consistent tracking intervals. A malfunction. Perhaps, but malfunctions rarely behave with such continuity. And then came the first moment that separated this event from everything routine. The contact crossed into another radar zone, a separate area of coverage, a different part of the system, and it did not disappear. That detail mattered more than anything else so far, because isolated radar artifacts can exist. They can appear within a single system and vanish when that system is no longer in contact with the same conditions. But when a signal moves across multiple coverage zones and remains intact, it begins to resemble something far more physical than electronic interference. Something that exists independently of the system observing it. The room did not change suddenly. There were no alarms, no dramatic reactions. Just a quiet increase in attention, a shared understanding forming between trained observers who did not yet have permission professional or psychological to call it anything unusual. Still, the feeling was there. This was no longer just another return. It was becoming a track, and once something becomes a track in radar terms, it becomes part of the night's official memory. The operators continued watching, the signal continued moving, and somewhere in that steady exchange between machine and sky, the first subtle question formed, not spoken, not written, but understood. What exactly are we tracking? Because whatever it was not behaving like anything they had been trained to expect, and it was not slowing down. The signal begins to defy expectation. Chapter 3. When motion breaks the rules. There's a moment in every radar room when observation stops being routine and becomes something else entirely. It does not arrive with alarms or announcements. It arrives quietly, through comparison what you are seeing versus what you know should be possible. And once that gap opens, even slightly, everything after it feels different. On the screen at Lakenheath, the contact had already begun to move beyond simple classification. It was fast, faster than expected. But speed alone was not what unsettled the operators. Aircraft can be fast. Weather systems can shift quickly. Even errors can appear sudden. What made this different was structure. The movement was not chaotic. It was not drifting or wandering. It was organized as if following an internal logic that did not match any known flight behavior. And then, without warning, that motion changed. It stopped. Not gradually. Not with the subtle reduction that every trained observer expects when thinking about momentum, propulsion, and controlled descent. It simply ceased. One moment, the signal was moving across the radar scope with undeniable velocity. The next, it was still, as if the sky had decided to hold it in place. Inside the room, there was a shift, not loud, not visible in any dramatic way, but noticeable in posture, in attention, in the way silence suddenly felt more concentrated. Because radar operators understand something very simple. Nothing in conventional aviation behaves like that. Aircraft do not stop mid-motion. Not in open air. Not without consequence. Not without distance, time, and controlled deceleration. And yet the screen showed exactly that. A stationary return, where movement had just been. The operator did what trained personnel always do in such moments. He checked the system in his mind first, then through procedure. Calibration. Stability. Consistency. Everything held. The signal was still there. Still stable. Still real in the only way radar can define reality. But now it was behaving like something that had chosen not to move anymore. Not like something that had failed. That distinction mattered, even if no one said it out loud. Time passed in a way that felt slightly distorted in the room, not because time itself changed, but because attention had tightened around a single point. When that happens, everything outside that focus becomes quieter, less relevant, almost distant. Then came the second development, another radar input, a separate observation emerging within the same operational space, suggesting proximity between the stationary contact and a routine flight pod, C-47 transport aircraft, moving through the region at altitude. At first, this was just data alignment, two independent tracks appearing near each other in space. But then, the human layer entered the situation. The C-47 crew reported something unusual, a bright light, positioned beneath their aircraft, not far away on the horizon, not abstract or distant, directly below. The report came without context. No prompting, no awareness of what ground radar was tracking, just an observation made in real time by people doing an entirely separate task. Suddenly confronted with something that did not fit their expectations of the night. This is where the nature of the event begins to change, because now there are no longer isolated systems operating independently. There is overlap. Ground radar sees a stationary contact. Airborne crew sees a luminous object in the corresponding region. Two different environments, two different perspectives. One shared point in space. And the strange part is not just that both reports existed, is that they match closely enough to feel connected, yet remain independent enough to avoid suspicion of coordination. No one had instructed the crew to look for anything. No one had told radar operators what pilots might see. And yet both accounts begin to describe the same area of sky in different languages. At this point, the room at Lakenheath is no longer just observing data. It is beginning to interpret relationships. An interpretation always carries weight, because it implies meaning. But the night does not allow certainty yet. The signal is still present. The reports are still forming, and the situation is quietly expanding beyond a single station's control. Because something that started as a radar contact is now becoming a shared observation across air and ground, and that is where things begin to feel irreversible. Not because anyone understands what is happening, but because too many systems are now agreeing that something is happening at all. What began as a signal becomes a shared sight. Chapter 4. When the night starts to multiply. By the time information begins to spread between stations, something subtle changes in how the night is experienced. It is no longer just one location watching the sky. It becomes multiple points of attention, each trying to understand its own fragment of a larger picture that no one can yet see in full. At Lakenheath, the radar room is still holding on to the earlier contact, still trying to interpret what it means that a moving signal can become motionless without warning. But now there is something else, something that makes the situation feel less contained than before. Because reports do not stay in one place for long in military systems like this. They travel through channels. They reach adjacent stations. They get compared, cross-checked, and quietly examined against other data streams. And as that process begins, another layer of the night starts to form. Far away at Bentwaters. A separate radar system is already doing what radar systems always do. Scanning, sweeping, recording the sky in its own structured rhythm. For most of the time, there is nothing unusual. Just routine returns, familiar patterns, expected movements, until there is not. A new contact appears. At first, it seems unrelated to Lakenheath's earlier track. Different position. Different timing, a separate observation entirely. That is how it would normally be treated. But the behavior of this new signal creates hesitation almost immediately. It is fast. Too fast for standard aircraft movement in that region. And more importantly, it does not behave like a typical pass-through contact. It does not simply enter the radar field and leave. It moves with continuity, as if it is aware of the space it is occupying. Operators begin to compare notes internally. Not with urgency yet, but with increasing attention. Because trained radar personnel understand a simple principle. Unusual speed alone is not enough to conclude anything, but unusual speed, combined with structured movement, begins to form a pattern, and patterns are what demand escalation. The contact at Bentwaters appears to align with earlier anomalies reported at Lakenheath. But no one is yet ready to assume they are the same object. That would require a level of certainty not yet justified by data alone. Still, the possibility begins to quietly exist in the background. Meanwhile, the sky itself remains unchanged to anyone outside these systems. No flashing lights visible from the ground. No public disturbance. No indication that anything unusual is unfolding above the countryside. This is one of the most striking aspects of the entire situation. From the ground, nothing appears different. But inside the radar rooms, reality is becoming increasingly layered. At Bentwaters, the signal continues its movement. Operators track it carefully now, not because they are alarmed, but because they are aware that they are observing something that does not comfortably fit existing categories. It is no longer just curiosity. It is verification in progress. Then comes the estimate that changes the tone of the room slightly. Speed calculations begin to suggest something far beyond expected limits. Not marginally beyond, significantly beyond. enough that experienced personnel begin to recheck assumptions rather than accept the first interpretation. In military radar work, numbers are not just numbers. They are indicators of potential action. If something is moving fast enough, it becomes a question of identification. If it is unidentified, it becomes a question of intent. And intent is what drives decisions. At this point, Bentwaters is no longer observing in isolation. The data begins to be considered in relation to what Lakenheath has already recorded. Two separate systems, two separate regions, and yet the behavior being described begins to feel uncomfortably similar. Fast movement, structured tracking, anomalous stability in motion. The idea that these could be unrelated events becomes harder to maintain. Still, no one states anything definitively. Military procedure resists assumption. It requires confirmation, and confirmation is still forming. But the night is now in motion in a different way, because once two independent stations begin to detect similar anomalies, the situation is no longer local. It becomes regional. And regional patterns are harder to dismiss. Back at Lakenheath, earlier signals are still being reviewed, compared, and mentally reconstructed. The stationary contact, the C-47 observation. The alignment of radar and visual reports. Each piece is still present, still unresolved, still waiting for meaning. And now Bentwaters is adding its own layer to the same unfolding narrative. Without coordination. Without shared instruction, just parallel observation converging on something that neither station can fully explain alone. There is a moment, in systems like this, when uncertainty stops being individual and becomes collective. That moment is beginning to form. Not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Because when two separate radar installations begin reporting similar behavior in the same night, the question is no longer whether something is being seen. The question becomes what is being seen across both of them. And that question, once formed, does not go away easily. It simply waits for the next piece of evidence to arrive. Separate skies begin describing the same unknown. Chapter 5. The decision to send fighters. There is a point in every military tracking event where observation is no longer enough. That point does not arrive because of fear alone. It arrives because of procedure. Because when data crosses certain thresholds, systems are designed to escalate, not speculate. Radar can watch. Operators can interpret, but at some stage, the sky must be approached directly. At Bentwaters, that threshold begins to take shape in the form of numbers. Speed estimates that do not sit comfortably within known aircraft performance. Movement patterns that do not resemble civilian or military traffic. A contact that behaves less like a passing object and more like something moving through controlled airspace with intention. An intention, in military terms, changes everything. Because intention implies direction, and direction implies risk. Inside the radar room, the atmosphere remains controlled, but it is no longer neutral. Operators continue tracking, continuing to refine estimates, continuing to confirm that what they are seeing is consistent over time. There is no single dramatic moment of panic. Instead, there is a gradual tightening of focus, as if everyone in the room is quietly realizing that the situation is no longer staying within expected boundaries. At these days, the question is no longer whether the signal exists. It clearly does. The question is what it represents, and that question cannot be answered from a distance indefinitely. Somewhere in the chain of command, reports begin to move upward. Carefully phrased, precise, avoiding exaggeration, but containing enough clarity that the unusual nature of the contact cannot be ignored. A fast-moving object, unidentified, tracked on radar, possibly exceeding known performance limits. These are not sensational words. They are operational words. And in military communication, operational words carry weight. As the information reaches decision-makers, another layer of analysis begins, cross-referencing with other stations, comparing with known flight activity, checking for exercises, misidentified aircraft, atmospheric interference. But the problem is consistency. The reports from Bentwaters are not isolated, and Lakenheath, still processing its earlier sequence of events, provides a parallel context that makes dismissal increasingly difficult. 2 stations, separate systems, similar patterns. And now a growing awareness that whatever is being tracked is not remaining in one predictable location. At some point, the decision becomes procedural rather than interpretive. Interceptors will be launched. The order is not presented as dramatic. It does not need to be. It is simply a continuation of protocol. When an object cannot be identified and continues to exhibit unusual behavior within controlled airspace, the next step is interception. The responsibility shifts from passive observation to active engagement. At rough stations, aircraft are prepared with efficiency shaped by training and repetition. Pilots are briefed with clarity, not with speculation, but with available facts. There is an unknown contact. There is a radar track. There is a region of interest. Your task is to locate and identify. Nothing more is assumed. Yet everyone involved understands that once aircraft leave the ground, the situation changes in nature. Radar becomes only part of the picture. Human perception enters the equation directly, and whatever is in the sky will no longer exist solely as a trace on a screen. It will become something encountered. At Bentwaters, the Venom interceptors are readied. The aircraft themselves are not new or experimental. They are established military jets, familiar to their pilots, designed for interception roles that rely on speed and positioning. The pilots who climb into them are not expecting mystery. They are expecting identification, but expectation is not the same as outcome. As engines begin to power up and ground crews step back, the atmosphere shifts again, not into fear but into focus. Every movement is deliberate. Every instruction is standard. Yet, beneath the routine, there is an unspoken awareness that this is not a normal training exercise or routine interception, because they are not chasing a known aircraft. They are chasing a question. In the radar room, operators continue tracking the object as long as they can. The signal is still present, still moving, still resisting simple classification. Coordinates are relayed, updates are passed, and then the final confirmation is given. The interceptors are airborne. At that moment, the situation changes again, because radar can describe something, but now something is moving to meet it, and the sky over eastern England, which had remained observational for so long, is about to become active in a way that cannot be contained on screens alone anymore. Not yet confrontation, but approach. And approach always carries consequences. The sky is no longer only observed, it is being entered. Chapter 6. Into the radar shadow. Once the aircraft leave the ground, everything becomes less abstract. On radar screens, the situation is still data lines, blips, coordinates, movement patterns. But in the air, those same numbers transform into physical reality. Altitude, speed, wind resistance, engine vibration, night visibility that stretches into uncertainty. The Venom pilots climbing into the sky that night are not stepping into a mystery in the way later accounts might suggest. To them, it is still a controlled mission. A structured response to an unidentified contact, something unusual, yes, but still something that, in principle, should resolve once visual confirmation is achieved. That is how most interceptions are supposed to end. Locate, identify, return. Simple in design, even if not always simple in execution. But as the aircraft leveled out into darkness over eastern England, the simplicity begins to weaken, because the radar contact they are being guided toward is not behaving like a normal target. On the ground, operators continue feeding updates, directional cues, speed estimates, position shifts. The object is still present, still moving, still existing as a persistent anomaly across multiple systems. But now there is a second layer forming, one that cannot be fully captured on radar alone. The pilots are approaching something that is not waiting in a fixed position. It is moving through space in a way that feels aware, not in any human sense that can be proven, but in the way its movement seems to anticipate interception paths rather than react to them. As the Venom aircraft close distance, onboard radar begins to pick up a return. A solid contact. Not fragmented, not uncertain, clear enough to lock onto. For a moment, everything aligns in the way it should. Ground radar, airborne radar. Procedural expectational, converging on a single point of reference. And that is when visual contact begins to form. At first, it is just a light, not a shape, not a silhouette. Just a bright source against the darkness, too steady to be a star, too low and responsive to be astronomical, too mobile to be fixed. The pilot reports it, calmly at first, because calm is part of training, but the meaning behind the words begins to shift almost immediately. Because seeing something with your eyes while also tracking it with instruments creates a dual confirmation that removes ambiguity in a way radar alone cannot. This is no longer an electronic anomaly. It is something present in physical space. The pilot attempts to close distance, and the response is immediate in behavior, if not in language. The object moves, not away in a predictable arc, not along a linear escape path. It shifts position in a way that breaks the expected geometry of pursuit, as if the space between interceptor and target is not a simple line, but something that can be restructured. The venom adjusts course. The pilot tries to re-establish intercept positioning. Standard training takes over. Control, angle, speed, anticipation, but the target does not behave like something being chased. It behaves like something participating. For a brief moment, the radar trace suggests something even more disorienting. The object is no longer ahead. It is behind. In aviation terms, that position, 6 o'clock, is everything. It is vulnerability. It is pursuit. It is the moment where roles reverse in the most unsettling way possible. A hunter becomes the one being followed. Inside the cockpit, there is no room for interpretation beyond the instruments and the immediate sensory reality. The pilot responds instinctively, adjusting, maneuvering, attempting to regain positional advantage, but every correction is met with equal or greater adjustment from the unknown contact, as if it is not only tracking the aircraft, but matching its intent. Time compresses in moments like this. 10 minutes can feel like something much longer when every second demands reaction without certainty. The sky becomes less like an environment and more like a shared space of competing awareness. Two objects, one human, one unknown, and yet the balance of control does not feel stable in the way it should. There is no sonic signature that matches expectations, no visible propulsion that explains acceleration, no predictable pattern of retreat or engagement, just movement and response and repositioning that defies the usual language of pursuit. At some point, the pilot disengages from the idea of chasing and begins simply trying to maintain awareness, because pursuit implies hierarchy: one leading, one following. But here, that hierarchy feels absent or reversed in ways that cannot be fully acknowledged while still maintaining operational focus. Then, as suddenly as it escalated, the contact begins to withdraw. Not in defeat, not in evasion, simply departure. Accelerating away at a rate that overwhelms tracking capacity, leaving radar systems struggling to maintain lock until the signal is gone entirely. No debris, no sound, no trace in the sky that matches the intensity of what had just been experienced. Only absence. Back at ground stations, operators see the same thing. A return that had been stable, then rapidly unstable, then gone. And in that disappearance, something important becomes clear without needing to be said aloud. Whatever had been tracked was not simply passing through the airspace. It had been interacting with it, and with the interceptor, as if the sky itself had become a temporary meeting point between two very different kinds of motion. The venom returns eventually. The radar rooms continue their logs, but the meaning of what occurred begins to settle in slowly, the way complex events always do after they are over, through silence, through comparison, through the uncomfortable realization that no standard explanation fits neatly. Because this was not just detection, and not just pursuit. It was engagement. And engagement implies something that neither side fully understood. A shared awareness in the night sky that refused to behave like anything expected. The chase ends, but the questions begin to multiply. Chapter 7. The Night That Refused to End. Long after the interceptor's return, the feeling inside the radar rooms does not immediately settle back into normality. That is something people often assume about military operations, that once the object is gone, the situation resets, the screens return to routine, the logs close. The night continues as if nothing unusual happened. But in reality, That is not how perception works when something has broken expectations so completely. Because even when the signal disappears, its absence does not feel like closure. It feels like interruption. At RAF Lakenheath and RAF Bentwaters, operators continue their duties, but something subtle has changed in how they interpret every return afterward. The screens are the same, the equipment is unchanged, the procedures remain intact, yet attention is different now, more cautious, more sensitive, as if the system itself has learned that the sky is capable of behaving in ways it had not previously accounted for, and that awareness lingers. The intercepted object is no longer visible on radar. No residual track remains. No secondary signal appears to confirm its position. It is simply gone in the most difficult way to interpret without explanation, without trace, without confirmation of what its disappearance actually means. In most cases, disappearance suggests failure in tracking. But here, there had been too much consistency before the disappearance to dismiss it that easily. Multiple systems had agreed. Multiple observers had confirmed. Multiple phases of tracking had reinforced one another. And then, suddenly, nothing. That contrast is what makes the silence feel heavier than the activity that preceded it. Far from the radar rooms, the night over eastern England remains visually unchanged. If someone were to look up at the sky, there would be no indication of what had just occurred above them. No visible disruption, no lingering light, no atmospheric anomaly that would suggest a prolonged engagement had taken place. And yet, inside the military network, the event continues to exist in a different form. As recorded data, as witness, memory, as overlapping accounts that resist simple alignment with known categories. The reports begin to circulate more formally now, transferred into structured documentation, reviewed by senior personnel. Compared across stations, each detail is examined not for drama, but for consistency. And consistency is what keeps the incident alive. Because if even a portion of the accounts were inconsistent, the case would begin to collapse into uncertainty. But instead, the opposite happens. The more the reports are compared, the more they seem to reinforce each other. Ground radar observations, airborne radar lock, visual confirmation from pilots, independent reports from transport aircraft crews. Each layer does not weaken the others. It strengthens them. And that creates a problem that is not easily resolved within normal investigative frameworks, because military systems are designed to eliminate ambiguity, to reduce uncertainty, to classify unknowns into known categories, whenever possible. But here, classification becomes increasingly difficult, not because information is missing, but because information is too consistent across different systems that are not supposed to align so perfectly unless observing something real. As the night continues, investigators begin reconstructing the sequence of events in detail, not as a single narrative yet, but as separate threads. A radar track that appeared at Lakenheath, a sudden stop in motion. A visual confirmation from a C-47 crew, a second, faster-moving contact at Bentwaters. The scramble of interceptors, the radar lock in flight, the visual encounter, the reversal of position during pursuit, the abrupt disappearance. Each piece is examined carefully, as if the meaning might emerge from arrangement alone. But the more it is studied, the more it resists simplification, because every explanation that fits one part of the sequence begins to struggle with another. Atmospheric interference cannot account for radar lock and visual confirmation. Instrument malfunction cannot explain consistent tracking across multiple stations. Misidentification cannot account for sustained behavior over time. And human error becomes harder to invoke when multiple trained observers, separated by distance and role, report aligned experiences. So the incident remains suspended in a kind of analytical limbo. Not explained, not dismissed, not fully understood, just held in documentation, waiting for interpretation that never quite arrives. And in that waiting, something important happens. The event begins to transform from an active encounter into a historical case. Something to be studied rather than experienced. Something to be referenced rather than reacted to. But even that transition does not reduce its impact. Because certain events do not lose significance when they end. They gain it. As analysts review radar logs and pilots write formal statements, a quiet realization begins to form in the background of institutional thinking. Whatever was encountered that night behaved in a way that did not match known aerospace capability at the time, and not just slightly beyond expectations, but far beyond them. Enough that even cautious interpretation begins to feel strained. And so the night refuses to fully end in a psychological sense, even after it has ended physically, because something about it continues to demand attention. Not as a mystery to be sensationalized, but as a problem that has not yet found a satisfying place inside existing understanding. And that is often where the most enduring cases begin to live, not in the moment of observation, but in the long aftermath of trying to explain what was already seen. The record begins to outlast the event itself. Chapter 8. The weight of records. By morning, the sky over eastern England looks ordinary again. That is often the most unsettling part of events like this. The way the world refuses to reflect what happened in it. Fields are still fields. Roads are still roads. Clouds move with their usual indifference. Nothing in the landscape carries memory in a visible way. But inside the military infrastructure, the night has not dissolved. It has been preserved. Not in emotion, not in speculation, but in documentation. Radar logs sit in structured form, time-stamped and precise. Operator notes are written with disciplined language, carefully avoiding exaggeration. Pilot reports are filed according to procedure. Cross-references begin to form between stations that, only hours earlier, were operating in parallel rather than in coordination. This is where the incident begins to change shape again. Because lived experience becomes recorded history, and recorded history carries a different kind of authority. At Ref Lakenheath, technicians review the earlier track from the radar system. Frame by frame, moment by moment, they reconstruct what had appeared during the night. The fast movement, the sudden halt, the persistence of the signal across coverage zones. Each element is checked against known system behavior. Everything technical appears sound. No obvious malfunction. No clear indication of equipment failure. No internal inconsistency that would explain the pattern as an artifact. That alone is significant, even before interpretation begins. Because in radar analysis, the simplest resolution is often system error. When that explanation is unavailable, the list of possibilities begins to narrow. At RAF Bentwaters, a parallel review is underway. Operators compare their own logs with those from Lakenheath. At first, the comparison is informal, an attempt to understand whether the two stations were observing separate events or overlapping ones. But the further they go, the more alignment they find. Time correlations begin to emerge. Similar movement patterns, similar speed estimates, similar phases of activity. And when two independent systems begin describing similar behavior in overlapping time frames, the assumption of coincidence becomes harder to maintain. Still, no one rushes toward conclusions. Military analysis does not reward speed of interpretation. It rewards accuracy, and accuracy requires restraint, even when the data feels unusually consistent. Meanwhile, the C-47 crew report is added to the collection. Their account stands apart in an important way. It is not derived from radar interpretation. It is not influenced by ground tracking. It is a direct observation made in the air, under operational conditions unrelated to the radar investigation. A bright object beneath their aircraft. No prior expectation of encountering anything unusual. No coordination with other stations. Just an independent sighting that aligns, in timing and position, with other recorded data. That alignment is what gives the report its weight. Because in investigative work, independence is critical. When separate systems, human and mechanica, converge on similar observations without interaction, the probability of shared error decreases significantly. And here, that convergence is difficult to ignore. As the records accumulate, a quiet shift begins to occur in how the incident is treated internally. It is no longer discussed as a single anomaly. It becomes a case. A structured event with multiple components, each requiring individual examination. Radar behavior, pilot, engagement, cross-station tracking. Visual confirmation. Each layer is treated with seriousness, not because any one element is definitive, but because together they form a structure that resists simple reduction. And that resistance creates tension within analysis, because the purpose of investigation is to resolve uncertainty. But here, uncertainty is not being resolved. is being reinforced by consistency across different forms of evidence. In some cases, this would point toward a coordinated event or known phenomena misinterpreted across systems, but there is no known category that comfortably absorbs all aspects of what was recorded that night. Not at the time, and not easily in hindsight. As the morning progresses, senior personnel begin reviewing summaries of the incident. These summaries are careful, measured, and deliberately non-speculative. They avoid language that implies certainty beyond what the data supports. But even within that restraint, a pattern is visible. Something moved through controlled airspace. It was tracked by radar. It was seen visually. It interacted with a military interceptor, and it behaved in ways that do not align with conventional aircraft performance of the era. That is the core of the record. Simple in phrasing, difficult in implication, because once written down in official form, the event stops being an isolated story and becomes part of institutional memory. An institutional memory does not forget easily. It waits for explanation, or for reevaluation, or for future frameworks that might make sense of what earlier systems could not. But at this stage, none of that exists yet. Only documentation. And the quiet realization that the night produced something that cannot be easily categorized without leaving parts of it unresolved. The sky has returned to normal, but the record has not. And in many ways, that is where the real weight of the incident begins to settle. Not in the moment it happened, but in the fact that it was captured so clearly, and still remains difficult to fully explain. The documents begin to outlive the certainty of interpretation. Chapter 9. When certainty starts to split. In most investigations, certainty arrives in stages. First, there is observation. Then, comparison. Then, interpretation. And finally, conclusion. Even when the conclusion is uncertain, it still provides structure, a place where the unknown is placed into a category that feels manageable. But with the Lakenheath Bentwaters Incident, that final stage does not arrive cleanly. Instead, certainty begins to split, not because the data disappears, but because the data refuses to align into a single, simple explanation. As analysts continue reviewing the records, something becomes increasingly clear. Every attempt to simplify the event creates a gap somewhere else in the timeline. If the radar return was an error, then why did multiple stations register similar movement patterns? If it was atmospheric interference, then why did airborne radar lock onto a distinct target? If it was misidentified aircraft, then why did speed estimates exceed known performance limits of the time? Each explanation resolves one piece, while destabilizing another, and that imbalance begins to accumulate. At RAF Lakenheath and RAF Bentwaters, the technical teams are not debating theories in dramatic terms. They are comparing logs, verifying timestamps, and checking system integrity. The work is methodical, almost patient. But beneath that patience, there is a growing awareness that the usual categories are not holding together comfortably. Because radar systems, by design, are expected to disagree when errors occur. That disagreement is what allows technicians to isolate faults. But here, something unusual is happening. The systems are agreeing too often. And when independent systems agree under conditions where disagreement is expected, it forces a different kind of question. Not what is wrong with the data, but what is consistent across the data. Meanwhile, the human accounts continue to be reviewed with equal care. The Venom pilot's descriptions remain consistent with their initial reports. The maneuvering object, the rapid repositioning, the moment of reversal where pursuit becomes disorientation, these are not embellished over time. They remain stable across debriefs. The C-47 crew's observation also remains unchanged, a bright object beneath the aircraft. No ambiguity introduced in later reflection. No revision that weakens the original claim. And this stability across time adds another layer of complexity, because human memory is often expected to drift, to soften or to reshape itself around explanation. But here, key details remain fixed in a way that reinforces rather than weakens the original accounts. So now there are two forms of stability present. Machine stability in radar, tracking consistency, human stability in repeated testimony. And when both forms align, the investigative space becomes narrower, not clearer, narrower. Because fewer explanations remain viable. At these stage, internal discussions begin to reflect a subtle shift in tone. Still formal, still cautious, but with increasing recognition that the incident is not resolving into familiar categories. The word unidentified begins to carry more weight than it usually does. In most cases, unidentified is temporary, a placeholder. Before classification, a label that eventually gives way to something more concrete. But here, that transition does not occur. The label remains, and the absence of replacement becomes meaningful in itself. As days pass, the incident is compared against known phenomena. Balloon activity is ruled out due to speed and maneuver patterns. Meteorological explanations fail to account for sustained tracking and radar lock. Conventional aircraft are excluded due to performance limitations and lack of flight records matching the behavior observed. Even experimental possibilities are considered, but no known program or capability aligns with the recorded data. What remains is not a solution. It is a collection of inconsistencies that all point in the same direction without converging into a single answer. And that is where certainty begins to fracture, because certainty depends on convergence. When all evidence points toward one explanation, confidence increases. But when all evidence resists convergence, certainty does not simply weaken. It divides into competing interpretations. Some within the investigative structure lean toward unknown natural phenomena. Others remain cautious, preferring to leave the case open without assigning speculative origin. A few quietly acknowledge that the behavior observed exceeds known aerospace capability, but stop short of defining what that implies. And this divergence itself becomes part of the record, not just what was seen, but how it is interpreted differently even within the same system. Outside of official analysis, the incident begins to develop a second life, not as speculation, but as reference. A case study, an example used to illustrate the challenges of multi-sensor interpretation, because this is where the event gains its long-term significance. Not in what it definitively proves, but in what it refuses to resolve. It becomes a boundary case. A situation that tests the limits of classification systems designed to reduce ambiguity. And when a system designed to eliminate uncertainty encounters an event that does not yield to elimination, something important happens. The system begins to adapt around the anomaly rather than absorb it, and that adaptation is slow, quiet, unacknowledged in any single document, but visible in the accumulation of unresolved status across reports. By the time formal conclusions are considered, one fact stands out more than any other. No single explanation can account for the entire sequence of events without leaving significant portions unexplained. And that is not a statement of belief, it is a statement of limitation. The investigation does not end with resolution. It ends with boundaries, and those boundaries define what remains unknown. The case becomes less about what happened and more about what cannot yet be explained. Chapter 10. The Silence. After the data, after the analysis slows, something unexpected happens. Not closure. Silence. But not the kind of silence that comes from resolution. This is a different kind, one that forms when information has been exhausted, but understanding has not arrived. The radar logs remain. The pilot reports remain. The cross-station comparisons remain carefully filed and preserved. Nothing is missing. Nothing has been lost to time or neglect. And yet, the meaning of it all refuses to settle. In the days following the incident, life at RAF Lakenheath and RAF Bentwaters returns to its usual rhythm. Aircraft operations continue. Training schedules resume. Radar stations continue their constant surveillance of the sky, as they always have. From the outside, nothing appears changed. But internally, something has shifted in a way that does not show up in official records. Because once you have seen something that does not fit into established categories, you do not unsee it by returning to routine. You only learn to live alongside the unanswered question. Operators continue their work with the same discipline as before, but there is a subtle difference in attention, a kind of quiet awareness that somewhere in the system, there exists a recorded event that did not behave according to expectation, not as rumor, not as speculation, but as documented observation. And that distinction matters, because documentation carries authority. As time passes, discussions about the incidents become more structured, not in public conversation, but within internal analysis and later historical review. The case is referenced, revisited, and compared against other unusual aerial reports. Each time it is examined, the same pattern emerges. Multiple independent systems recorded a coherent sequence of events. Radar systems at different locations tracked similar anomalies. Airborne radar locked onto a target that matched ground observations. Visual sightings confirmed luminous activity in the same region. A fighter interceptor engaged with a target that demonstrated unconventional behavior. And then, the contact disappeared without trace. There is no single point in the sequence where the data collapses into a simple explanation. Instead, it holds together too well in structure, while refusing to resolve in meaning. That combination is rare. In most investigative cases, inconsistencies lead to dismissal. But here, consistency itself becomes part of the challenge. Because when multiple systems agree, but the meaning of their agreement is unclear, investigators are left in a position that is more uncomfortable than contradiction. They are left with coherence, without interpretation. As official reviews conclude, the incident is placed into classification categories that reflect its unresolved nature. It is labeled, archived, and stored among other cases that resisted definitive explanation. But labels do not reduce the weight of what was experienced. They only organize it. And organization is not the same as understanding. Over time, new generations of researchers revisit the case, not because it has changed, but because context has changed around it. Advances in aerospace technology, improvements in radar systems, and new frameworks for analyzing aerial phenomena all provide fresh perspectives. Yet each time the case is re-examined, it continues to resist full resolution. Modern comparisons introduce new questions rather than eliminating old ones. Could advanced technology explain the performance reported? Could unknown atmospheric effects account for radar and visual alignment? Could misinterpretation of multiple systems create the appearance of coherence where none existed? Each question is valid, and each fails to fully absorb every part of the record. That is the enduring tension of the case. It does not sit comfortably on either side of certainty. It does not confirm extraordinary conclusions. But it also does not dissolve into ordinary explanation. Instead, it remains suspended, a structured event without a final interpretation, and that suspension is what gives it longevity. Because unanswered cases do not disappear. They accumulate meaning over time, not because the facts change, but because the frameworks used to interpret them continue to evolve. And somewhere in that evolution, the Lakenheath Bentwaters Incident remains fixed as a reference point, a reminder that even well-documented systems, operated by trained professionals, can encounter events that do not fit neatly into the language available at the time. And perhaps that is why the silence after the data feels so significant, because it is not empty. It is full of unresolved structure, full of recorded certainty that never quite became understanding. And that kind of silence tends to last much longer than answers ever do. What remains is not conclusion, but continuity. Chapter 11. When history refuses to close the file, time has a strange effect on unresolved events. It does not erase them. It does not resolve them. It simply changes the context in which they are read, as if each new decade adds a different layer of lighting to the same fixed scene. The Lakenheath Bentwaters incident begins to take on that quality as years pass. The radar logs remain unchanged. The pilot reports remain unchanged. The structured documentation stays exactly as it was written in 1956. But the world interpreting those documents is no longer the same world that produced them. Technology advances. Aviation evolves. Radar systems become more precise, more sensitive, more capable of filtering noise from signal. And with each advancement, a natural expectation forms that older mysteries will eventually dissolve under improved understanding. That is often how progress works, but not always. Because when investigators return to this case with newer tools, something unusual happens. The clarity of modern analysis does not erase the event. It sharpens its outline. The more precise the comparison tools become, the more distinct the original anomaly appears against known benchmarks. Speed estimates are re-evaluated. Even with allowances for error, the reported performance still sits outside comfortable ranges for known aircraft of the era. Radar tracking consistency is reassessed. And while minor uncertainties are acknowledged, the multi-station alignment remains unusually strong. Visual confirmations are reinterpreted through modern understanding of perception, distance, and atmospheric conditions. Yet even with caution applied, the convergence of independent sightings remains difficult to fully dismiss. In other words, time does not weaken the case. It reframes it, and reframing is not the same as resolution. As new generations of researchers encounter the incident, they often do so through comparison. Modern unidentified aerial phenomena reports begin to surface in different contexts: military footage, sensor data, pilot testimony collected under more formalized reporting systems, and something interesting begins to emerge in those comparisons. The language starts to resemble itself across decades. Objects described as hovering without visible propulsion, rapid acceleration without conventional transition, movement that appears to ignore expected aerodynamic constraints. These patterns are not identical in every case, but they echo, and when echoes appear across time, investigators naturally begin to ask whether they are hearing separate events or different expressions of the same underlying phenomenon. The Lakenheath Bentwaters case becomes part of that conversation, not as proof of any particular conclusion, but as an early, highly documented instance of a pattern that seems to reappear under modern observation. In institutional settings, the case is sometimes referenced quietly as an example of strong multi-sensor correlation without definitive identification. Not sensationalized, not dismissed, just retained. As a reference point, a baseline, a reminder of what a well-documented unresolved event looks like when all standard explanations have been carefully examined and still fail to fully converge, and that status gives it a kind of stability in historical analysis. It does not move toward closure, it holds its position. Meanwhile, public interest in aerial anomalies grows over time, especially in later decades when governments begin acknowledging unidentified aerial phenomena more openly. This shift does not change the historical record of the 1956 event, but it changes how it is discussed. What was once an isolated Cold War-era incident becomes part of a broader, ongoing pattern of unexplained aerial observations. And with that shift, the case gains a new role. It becomes historical evidence in a modern conversation, not because it has been newly discovered, but because it has never been fully explained away. Still, even as comparisons multiply, the core of the Lakenheath Bentwaters Incident remains unchanged. A night of structured observation, multiple independent systems recording correlated behavior, aerial interception resulting in an unusual engagement dynamics, and an eventual disappearance that leaves no physical trace, no fragments, no recovered material, no definitive origin, only records. And records, no matter how detailed, do not interpret themselves. They wait for interpretation, sometimes briefly, sometimes for decades, and sometimes, as in this case, for so long that the waiting itself becomes part of the story, because what endures is not just the data. It is the inability of the data to fully resolve into meaning, and that is where the incident continues to live, not in conclusion, but in continuity. Even as the world changes, the unanswered night remains unchanged. Chapter 12. The Modern Mirror. In the modern era, the sky is no longer watched only by radar stations and human eyes. It is observed through infrared sensors, satellite networks, digital tracking systems, and multi-layered defense grids that can record details far beyond what was imaginable in 1956. The expectation is simple. The more advanced the tools become, the fewer mysteries should remain. And yet, something unexpected happens when modern data is compared with older cases. The patterns do not disappear. They repeat. When analysts examine historical incidents like Lakenheath Bentwaters alongside contemporary unidentified aerial phenomena reports, they notice something that is difficult to ignore. Not identical events, but familiar behavior. Objects described in modern reports sometimes appear to hover without visible propulsion, just as earlier witnesses described stationary light sources that defied expected motion. Sudden acceleration remains a recurring theme, even in reports collected under strict military protocols. And perhaps, most strikingly, the issue of tracking consistency across multiple sensors continues to appear in both historical and modern data. The technology has changed completely, but the descriptions feel connected in structure. This creates a strange kind of mirror effect across time. The 1956 incident begins to look less like an isolated historical anomaly and more like an early entry in a longer, still unfolding record of unexplained aerial behavior. Modern agencies tasked with investigating unidentified aerial phenomena do not treat these comparisons lightly. Their focus is not on speculation, but on correlation. What different sensors, different eras, and different observers consistently report when observing unknown objects in controlled airspace. And here, Lakenheath Bentwaters often reappears as a reference point, not because it provides answers, but because it provides a rare combination of qualities that modern analysts still value deeply. Multiple, independent radar systems, airborne confirmation, visual reports from trained military personnel, and a sustained duration of observation. Few historical cases contain all of these elements in such alignment, and so it becomes a kind of benchmark, a reference against which newer encounters are measured. But benchmarks do not explain phenomena. They only define standards of comparison. As modern datasets accumulate, analysts begin to notice something else. The challenge is not simply identifying what is being observed. It is determining how consistently different systems describe similar behaviors without arriving at a shared explanation. Radar systems interpret movement mathematically. Human observers interpret it visually. Infrared systems interpret it thermally. Yet in certain cases, all three layers seem to converge on a single unknown presence. That convergence is where complexity begins to deepen again. Because when different forms of observation agree on structure but not on identity, interpretation becomes increasingly difficult. This is where the Lakenheath Bentwaters Incident continues to hold its relevance. It does not provide a model for explanation. It provides a model for uncertainty under high-quality observation, and that is rare. In most historical cases, uncertainty is tied to missing data, poor visibility, or limited instrumentation. But here, uncertainty exists despite strong instrumentation, trained observers, and structured documentation. That is what makes it persist in analytical discussions. Not as mystery for entertainment, but as a technical challenge. A reminder that even well-instrumented environments can produce results that resist classification. And so, in modern discussions, the incident is often revisited not to ask what was it, in a speculative sense, but to ask a more grounded question. What does it mean when multiple reliable systems agree on something that still cannot be identified? That question does not have a simple answer, and it may not have one yet. But it shapes how historical and modern data are interpreted together. Because the mere effect does not just reflect similarity, it highlights continuity. A continuity of observation across decades, a continuity of unresolved classification, a continuity of events that appear to exist, yet resists final definition. And in that continuity, the Lakenheath Bentwaters Incident remains firmly in place, not as an isolated Cold War curiosity, but as part of a larger pattern that stretches forward into the present, still observed, still analyzed, still not fully explained. The past and present begin to overlap in the same unanswered question. Chapter 13. The question that remains. In the end, the Lakenheath Bentwaters Incident does not conclude the way most stories do. There is no final revelation that resolves every detail into a single, satisfying explanation. No definitive identification that closes the case with certainty. No moment where all conflicting interpretations suddenly align into agreement. Instead, there is something quieter, a record, a structured memory preserved across decades, still intact, still studied, still discussed whenever the history of unexplained aerial phenomena is examined with seriousness. And at the center of that record remains the same core sequence of events. A radar contact moving with unusual speed across monitored airspace. A sudden shift into stationary behavior that defies normal expectations of motion. Independent confirmation from airborne and ground-based systems. Visual reports from trained military personnel and an unconnected transport crew. A fighter interception that transforms observation into direct engagement. And a final disappearance that leaves no physical trace behind. Each part of the sequence is documented. Each part is supported by multiple sources. And yet, when assembled together, the full picture refuses to settle into a single, agreed interpretation. That is what keeps the incident alive in historical and technical discussion. Not mystery in the dramatic sense, but unresolved structure in the analytical sense. Over time, different explanations have been proposed, some grounded in atmospheric behavior, some in radar interpretation limits, some in misperception under operational stress, others in hypothetical capabilities that were not known or widely acknowledged at the time. Each explanation contributes something useful. Each resolves part of the picture, but none resolves the entire sequence without leaving gaps elsewhere. And so the case remains open in a very specific way. Not open because it is ignored, but open because it continues to resist complete closure. This is what makes it different from many other historical reports of unusual aerial activity. It is not built on a single witness. It is not dependent on a single sensor. It is not held together by isolated testimony or ambiguous imagery. It is built on convergence. Multiple systems, multiple observers, multiple layers of documentation, all pointing toward the presence of something that behaved in a way not fully accounted for by conventional understanding of the time. And convergence is difficult to dismiss without careful explanation. That is why, even decades later, the incident still appears in discussions of aerial phenomena, military observation, and sensor analysis, not as proof of a specific conclusion, but as a case study in the limits of interpretation. Because sometimes the most important cases are not the ones that answer questions. They are the ones that refine them. What does it mean when trained observers consistently report something they cannot identify? What does it mean when multiple independent systems register correlated behavior without a shared explanation? What does it mean when a structured, documented event resists classification even after extensive review? These questions remain, not because they were overlooked, but because they were fully examined and still did not yield a final answer. And so the incident continues to occupy a unique place in history. Not as legend, not as speculation, but as documented uncertainty, a moment when observation exceeded explanation, and when explanation, even after decades of review, still has not fully caught up to what was recorded. In that sense, the Lakenheath Bentwaters Incident is not just about something that appeared in the sky in 1956. It is about what happens when reliable systems encounter something they cannot fully define, and the record of that encounter outlives every attempt to simplify it. And perhaps that is why it continues to matter, because some questions do not disappear when time passes. They simply become clearer in shape, even as the answer remains out of reach. And the sky, unchanged, as ever, continues to hold the memory of that night. Not as certainty, but as question. One that still waits.